welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to our, I think it's the 14th annual Roger Hood lecture, but as I was thinking this just before, I seem to remember last time that Roger corrected me afterwards and told me whatever number I said last year was wrong. So it's possibly the 15th annual Roger Hood lecture. But anyway, we've had a lot of them, and and today we're very pleased to have Professor Katja Franko from the University of Oslo. This annual public lecture series was launched in 2006, I'm now doubting all of my dates as a historian, to honour and celebrate the long and distinguished career of Professor Roger Hood and his particular contribution to criminology in Oxford and further afield. Over the course of his career, Roger worked on a number of different topics. He's best known, however, for his work on capital punishment. And while Katja's area of specialism is quite different, she shares with Roger a commitment to and engagement with global matters. Roger's work, like Katja's, is not only often based on research elsewhere, but reminds us that we live in a deeply interconnected world. And this means that events and practices abroad affect us at home, just as events and practices that we do at home affect countries elsewhere. So as Katja will explain today in her presentation, this kind of approach to criminology raises profound moral questions about the world we live in, our obligations to ourselves and to others, and perhaps if we can try and find a moment of positive thinking, which is almost impossible these days, a way of thinking about how we might unite and work together. So let me now introduce Katja to you, and then I will hand over to her. Katja Franko is Professor of Criminology at the University of Oslo. She's published widely on matters on migration, borders, security, and surveillance of everyday life. She's the author of numerous books and edited collections, for instance, The Globalization of Crime, which is entering its 3rd edition, and The Borders of Punishment. Katja is a key figure in the field of border criminology, having written many of the foundational texts that open such matters up to critical inquiry. This evening, Katja will share with us some findings from her forthcoming book. In her lecture, she will examine how the figure of the Crimmigrant other has emerged not only as a central object of media and political discourse, but also as a distinct penal subject connecting migration and the logic of insecurity. So please join me in welcoming Katja.
Thank you very much, Mary. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really pleased, really glad to be here, and very glad particularly also to continue the connection between the University of Oslo and Oxford that Roger started also with his work on death penalty, and not least with his friendship and cooperation with Professor Niels Christie, who was also my PhD supervisor. So I'm really glad about that. Actually, there aren't many academic audiences that I would like to present my work to more than this one, and also that I feel I'm more scary than this one. So, but I think without further ado, I'll just sort of jump into this. And I would like to start this with a story that I encountered the visit to a New York museum called Lower East Side Tenement Museum. The museum tells a story of a building, 97 Orchard Street, and the migrant tenants that lived in the building over several decades. And it's particularly the story of the Bodily family, Adolfo and Rosaria, who together with 2-year-old Josephine and baby John moved into 97 Orchard Street in 1928. About 5 years after Adolfo, a stowaway from Palermo, landed in New York. Adolfo was a skilled cabinet maker, having begun to learn his trade at the age of 14. In 1935, one of the grimmest years of the Great Depression, he, like millions of others, was self-employed. Rosaria, the youngest of the 4 children in a relatively well-off family, also from Palermo, married Adolfo when she was 16 and he was 26. On what her daughter describes as doctored papers, Rosaria also came to America illegally a year after her husband arrived. Then, to regularize their situation, the two left for Canada and re-entered the United States legally. In moving several times before getting to Orchard Street, They behaved like many poor tenants during the Depression. Families forgot to pay September rent, then moved into another building in October after having secured a month's rent concession from the new landlord. Now, the story is in many ways unremarkable and shows the long historic trajectories of irregular migration, as well as the longevity of the intricate connections between migration and illegality. Rosaria and Adolfo's story is revealing of how migrants have throughout history employed survivor strategies which make them vulnerable to the use of state penal power. The realities of a migration of poor populations create an ever-expandable repertoire of acts that can call upon the use of criminalization and public condemnation. Illegal entry as a stowaway, the use of false documents, illegal re-entry, not paying rent, and unemployment. In contemporary Europe, such acts, and also in America of course, such acts as these committed by Rosaria and Adolfo Baldizzi are increasingly met with state penal measures, and ultimately deportation and cancellation of their claims to membership. The Lower East Side Tenement Museum, on the other hand, provides a different narrative. It is an acknowledgement of irregular migration as a possible path to membership and as a legitimate part of national history. And I think that such dynamics call upon some of the central insights about social processes surrounding criminalization. As Nils Christie, whom I mentioned before, said provocatively that crime does not exist. Only acts exist, acts often given different meanings within various social frameworks. Acts and the meaning given them are our data. Our challenge is to follow the destiny of acts through the universe of meanings, particularly what are the social conditions that encourage or prevent giving the acts the meaning of being crime. And I think this is quite a relevant point of inquiry that I would like to pursue in this talk. Because what I will do is sort of look at a development through which, in contemporary societies, particularly in Europe, migrants are increasingly, acts like the ones committed by Adolfo and Rosaria, are increasingly seen in terms of crime, and they, migrants or non-citizens, are defined as penal subjects. So what I would like to do is to sort of present or outline this condition of migrant or non-citizen as a distinct penal subject. The Crimmigrant other is a figure of the unwanted. This means that she or he is unwanted not also when it comes to sort of political discourse, but also for the liberal advocates of more humane border policies. The figure of the Crimmigrant other represents a challenge, because it paints the picture of migrants as innocent victims in need of help and deserving of hospitality. So consequently, the notion of the criminal immigrant has been to a large extent avoided also in academic discourse rather than addressed head-on. So in a sense, you could say that if migration is a sort of a tornado that is reshaping political landscapes in contemporary society, this notion has been very much sort of staying still in the eye of the tornado, and I think this is an omission that sort of needs to be corrected. The Crimmigrant other is by no means an attractive word. Even worse, it is, as I'm sure Nils Christie would have probably said, a dangerous word. It is a word which has the potential to preclude a deeper understanding and can prevent dialogue. At the same time, as I think, it can give us an understanding into some very central social dynamics that are taking place right now, especially connecting the logic of insecurity surrounding migration and the use of penal and even military power. So what I will do is sort of try to outline several sort of defining features, as I see them, of the Crimmigrant other. Now, these features have been presented in the work of others, many of whom are also present in this audience. At the same time, as what I will do is to sort of try to draw on the findings of a research project that I conducted together with my colleague Helene Gundhus, interviews with about 78 police officers conducting immigration control, predominantly in Norway, but also in Frontex operations. The interviews were conducted between 2012 and 2016. Now, so the empirical foundations will be mostly drawn from a Norwegian reality, but I'm hoping that to draw out of this some sort of more general insights. One of the first and perhaps most obvious and discussed features of the Crimmigrant other is, of course, the political and the media aspects of it. And these are the features that I will use the least time on. They have been described, Nicolas de Geneva has drawing on the work of Guy Debord has described it as a spectacle, the images and discourses of flooding, invasion, portraying migrants as a threat. I think what is important here is that the spectacular is not only related to the threat aspects, but also to the aspects of exclusion and the stage aspects of security. So the image on the right hand on top is actually a photograph taken at a staged exercise by the Austrian police with the border with Slovenia, where the migrants are actually actors who are being hired to showcase the sovereign power of the Austrian police and the ability of the Austrian state to control its borders. The spectacular is not only confined to the openly populist political climates in countries such as Hungary and the United States, but also in Norway. Norway had what has been described as its Arctic freeze. Now, I know that the quality is not very good, but in the January 2016 or winter 2015, about 5,500 mostly Syrian and Afghani refugees asylum seekers came to cross Norway's Arctic border with Russia on bikes, which created a lot of political debates about it. And for a period of time, Norwegian authorities started sending them back in the minus 32 degrees freezing on bikes back to Russia. Now, not many people were sent that way. I think it was about 300 people, actually. I mean, it's enough, nevertheless, but it was this the spectacular act of social exclusion, which I think is quite unusual for a country like Norway. But as I said, I will focus on, this won't be the main focus. What I am interested in is very much the everyday bureaucratic practices of production of the Crimmigrant other. And following Jonathan Simons and Foucault's encouragement to follow the body, I think one of the defining features of the Crimmigrant other is the relationship between migrant's body and the state. One of the first things that happens when a migrant enters a European state is that his or her fingerprints are being taken. These fingerprints are then fed into a system, a Eurodac system that allocates the responsibility for processing of asylum claims to different European countries. Now, what is interesting here is that what European states are trying to do is trying to create processes connecting truth about migrants with their state-defined systems of knowledge. This is not something which is new. As James Scott has very eloquently written about it, is that the creation of legible people is one of the defining features of statecraft. It is what is necessary for the state to allocate rights, property rights, and all kinds of welfare benefits, health benefits, and so on to their populations. It has been, as Kaplan and Torpy point out, this identificatory logic also includes the need to identify and track those who had wandered or traveled beyond the circle in which they were personally known. And this is what biometrics does. It's not just biometrics. What modern states are using is, for example, in Norway at least, it's quite common for the authorities to use skeletal tests, tooth tests, to ascertain the age of asylum seekers. And the point here is that the stories that these people come with are seen as not trustworthy. What is seen as trustworthy is their bodies that become certain bearers of truth. very much technologically and scientifically mediated truth. And what is also important here is this establishment of truth often involves the use of force. So EU Commission, for example, in May 2015, established that if migrants do not cooperate, member states should make use of specific and limited use of detention and use coercion as a last resort in order to get the fingerprints and sort of to make these databases operable. And what is also, I think, important here, that even though this kind of logic sort of resembles very much what states have always been trying to do in terms of creating legible people, these attempts to create legibility today are global. So the states are not only trying to identify their own populations, but they're trying to identify populations of other states and trying to ascertain their identity. So Norway or the UK, for example, are trying to find out who the people are, whether they come from Somalia or Afghanistan, mainly also not only to be able to give them rights, but also to be able to deport them. Because identity, being identified as a citizen of another state, is the cornerstone of deportability. And when it comes to bodies, of course, bodies are also bearers of threat. And here is one police officer describing how, for example, they are doing deportations. He said, "We are not health personnel, are in principle not supposed to get that type of information, are not supposed to ask about it either, of course. But one is clearly interested in knowing, are you contagious? Is it natural to use a face mask? Do you have tuberculosis, HIV? Preferably treat everyone just like in prisons. They have the same problem there. Treat everyone as if they were contagious. Use gloves. Do not let anyone cough directly at you. If someone is coughing a lot, use a face mask. Always be careful about blood." So my point here is that the Crimmigrant other very much has sort of bodily dimensions that I think are important aspects of his or her relationship with the state. Now, of course, one of the most important aspects is the legal question, or the question of illegality. And as Elspeth Guild sort of summarizes, she says that, put very simply, that an illegal immigrant is someone in respect of whose presence on the territory of the state has passed a law making mere existence a criminal offense. It is put sort of quite bluntly, but I think it's quite an important point here. That basically, as Katja Franko also has said, that the accident of being born in the global south becomes a legal handicap that a person sort of carries with them. And Cecilia Menjiva and Daniel Kahnström say that this is quite different when it comes to sort of penalizing these kinds of offenses, because when it comes to punishment, in most modern legal systems, it is the conduct that counts, not legal status. In immigration law, however, the relationship between legal conduct and status is inherently quite complicated. Illegality is close to becoming an existential condition. Now I'll show you some examples of how the officers that we talked to described these dynamics. So here is one officer from Oslo police describing a meeting with an Afghan citizen. It was probably that he gave false personal information, I guess. And yes, you can say that if you give false information to the police, you have committed a criminal offense. This is grounds for deportation the moment he gets a negative response on his asylum application. It means that he can be sent out with a ban on coming back again, opposed to that of being sent out and coming back the next day as a tourist. This is something that we have sometimes kept in mind, because it happens that, in a manner of speaking, one knows what's going on, that you, my friend, smell like trouble. Now, who smells like trouble is very much defined by racial and gender aspects of their identity. So it's not a coincidence that this was a question of a male Afghan citizen. But it sort of confirms this sort of existential condition pertaining to illegality, or what, for example, Kai Eriksson described as sort of, in terms of deviance, that deviance becomes a defining feature of somebody's defining aspects of somebody's identity. Here's another officer describing a different situation, saying, also from Oslo Police District, saying, what we are looking for is this a person who does criminal activities in Oslo? If we think that he's behaving in a way which suggests that he's doing crime, then we go in and do an immigration check to find out about his identity and background. And then you can quickly see in his phone activities, like, do you got white, do you got coke, right? And we understand that he's within, that he's doing shady business. And then it is natural that we take a step towards the criminal law track. What happens next is that we either discover that he has drugs on him. If he doesn't, we can start asking questions about immigration law. And then you can quickly see, for example, has he been in Norway long? Is he hiding information about his means of sustenance in Norway? And all that is relevant for immigration law. And then we arrest him on immigration law, first and foremost because we see that he's doing crime, but we cannot prove it in criminal law. And sort of this interchangeability of immigration and criminal law that has been also described by Juliet Stumpf and others as Crimmigrant law is very much a defining feature of this kind of condition of illegality being an existential condition. And it is what Sklansky has described as sort of finding a person first and then finding an offense that you can pin on them. Another feature, of course, is criminalization, pertaining to sort of criminalization of offences connected to immigration law. And Elevati has written about the British reality of this and pointed out that often these are dynamics that are quite symbolic. Now, in Norway, the criminalization has been particularly related to breaches of entry ban. Authorities in 2013 increased the penalties from 6 months, maximum 6 months imprisonment to 2 years. And I think what is interesting is that in the white paper preceding the increase in penalties, they wrote, the government wrote, the proposition can in addition contribute to the reduction of other types of criminality in Norway, since a large proportion of those who are punished for breaches of the entry ban are also reported for or convicted of other types of crime. In addition, those who will breach the entry ban will, for a longer period than before, not be able to commit new offences while they are in prison. This effect is likely to be substantial. So we see that the measure is directed at a particular perceived group of class of people who the authorities believe are systematically associated with criminality. And what we see is that breaches of the entry ban have become a very sort of rather substantial sort of part of prison sentences that are being given out in Norway. Statistics Norway recently published statistics saying that from less than 1,000 prison days per year before 2009, this kind of offences consists now of over 74 prison days in 2016. So we see that this is not just symbolic criminalization, but it is actually quite real. And about a third or 33% of Norwegian prisoners are foreign citizens. Now, the final aspect of the sort of the subjectivity of the Crimmigrant other is deportability, which again has been, at least in the Norwegian context, very much subjected to an increased use of state force and sanctions. And here is another officer who explained how this transition from before to now has taken place. He is working in the northern Norway. Before, it was more like that. Cases came in and one took up those that came in, and it was almost random how one discovered things. The way we do it now, we have a scheme with what we call responsible investigator. The week that you are responsible, you have the responsibility to go through all police registers, that is, all databases into which police register information. It was a different focus then. It was not something one focused on. It was like, at the end of the year, yes, we have so and so many expulsion cases. Now it is from the very beginning, that is from January, we go through what we have to produce, what is expected of each one of us, and in our unit we have to produce 75 expulsion cases. And this does not mean that we shall deport 75 persons, but we have to produce 75 expulsion cases that we instigate. So as a non-citizen of a given state, the crimmigrant other is potentially deportable. This means that he or she can not only be sanctioned by a community to various forms of social censure, punishment and exclusion to specially designated spaces such as prisons and correctional institutions. For his perceived deviance, the crimmigrant other can be and often is sanctioned with a complete and often permanent exclusion from the community. All their community networks and social ties are cut off by the punitive administrative sanctions. Now, what I think this quote also shows that deportability is also a result of specific bureaucratic production, that it depends on the state's willingness to produce this kind of results. In the Norwegian case, for example, officers were systematically educated through seminars how to deport more people, and the results are quite visible, particularly between 2007 and 2016. 2016 was the top year. The state sort of forcefully deported 8,078 people, which is almost 4 times as many as in 2007. Many of these expulsions pertain to the category of expulsion rejection of people who have a criminal conviction. Many of them are from Eastern Europe, because as Eastern European citizens, they have in principle rights to stay in Norway, so in order to be deported, they have to be punished first. And we discovered that often punishments are very minor and can sort of have to do only with fines. Nevertheless, the deportation is the result of it. So you could say that in a way Norway has built what my colleague Sigmund Buchmont has described as a deportation machine. And this is partly because Norway has defined deportation as a performance target for the police. So the police districts are measured according to how many deportation cases they instigate, as we saw, and this has been a very sort of effective way of increasing the numbers. Now, another feature of the crimmigrant other, which I will not use so much time on, is of course the power-knowledge relations. And again, I'm sorry about the quality of the images, but what I would like to sort of point out is that, as we saw when it comes to deportation targets, that the crimmigrant other is very much subjected to measurement, to the production of knowledge. So on your left-hand side, on top there, you have a Frontex report statistic including top 10 nationalities. Top 10 nationalities is sort of almost a genre that, at least in Norway, but also in Frontex reports and so on, the police have for sort of creating scales of deviance of foreign nationals. Then you have top nationalities of illegal entry, top nationalities of use of false documents, and so on. The measurement also pertains, like on the right-hand side, to the sort of measuring the criminogenic nature of immigrant population and their differences with native population. What I think is also important that Helene and I have written about elsewhere is what is not being measured. The aspects of migrants' victimization of vulnerability, like for example the numbers of people dying at the border in the Mediterranean, which is not a state responsibility and which is not no European state does systematically, but it's rather sort of the basket has been taken over now by NGOs and non-governmental organizations. So I think these are sort of the main aspects of what you could call the crimmigrant other that I think I could use one lecture on each one of them, but it just hopefully they give an overview. Now, to summarize, the crimmigrant other is subjected to a distinct form of penalty and a distinct penal regime that Mary and Emma Kaufman and others have described in much greater detail. It is a penal regime that is mixing elements of immigration law and criminal law, and it is sort of the use of penal power which produces alienage. It is not penal power whose purpose is to sort of correct, to morally reform, but its purpose is to banish and exclude. So this transformation has been described as a transformation from panopticism to banopticism, as Didier Bigot has pointed out. In the Norwegian context, this contrast is particularly striking because the inclusion, even of people who are committed of serious criminal offences, has always been the norm, the welfare penalty and so on. So I think Norway is a particularly good example of what Linda Bosniak described as hard on the outside, soft on the inside conception of citizenship. Norway's use of, very sort of extensive use of deportation, reliance on deportation, also I think in the European context, Norway could be described as a sort of deportation, among the deportation leaders, is remarkable. Vanessa Barker has written about this similar dynamics when it comes to Sweden and the walling up of the welfare state. Now, what I will do in the remaining time is to sort of look at aspects of the criminal other, or you could say the work this particular penal subject does, not in terms of sort of criminalization, secularization, and so on, but in terms of sort of the moral aspects, or you could say that that migration or migrants today are not simply securitized, criminalized, but also, I think, moralized. And I will start with a rather sort of long quote from a parliamentary inquiry that took place in Norway in February 2015, following the deportation of long-staying children with families, where the authorities were criticized for deporting this group, where they assumed that there was a political agreement that this group should not be deported, yet they were almost sort of they were part of this push towards achieving deportation targets, and the police sort of found themselves on the spot for that. And the union representative of the police immigration unit said the following: "It is in the employees' interest to know whether what they are doing is morally and ethically completely right. It is difficult for them to deport asylum seekers with a negative final decision. If they are in doubt that this is the right thing to do, this is why we need to know through political processes that this is an agreed policy. We cannot do anything about this because the ones we deport have said a final decision. So we are doing something that is legal, but the moral and ethical bit is important for PU employees as well. This is a very difficult job. It is a burden for the employees. It is a burden to deport families with children. It can be a burden to deport single adults with children as well, without children as well. A lot of our employees are concerned about doing things right so that they can go home and have a good conscience. They have done a good job and not have a bad conscience, even though many of them probably have." Now, I think that this quote shows that the use of penal power at the border is in many ways deeply problematic, also for the people deploying it, and can create deep moral discomfort. Now, it should also be pointed out that the controversy in this case was regarding deportation of children, which I think it is also important. Now, and it is particularly in this context of sort of deep moral discomfort that the notion of the Crimmigrant other performs a certain kind of work. As Kai Eriksson has pointed out, is that deviant forms of behavior are a valuable resource in the society. Or as Toni Morrison more recently said, that there are major benefits in creating and sustaining another. And what I would like to discuss, or continue to discuss, is precisely what kind of benefits or resources the idea of criminal migrants has for the performance of border work, and more generally for the processes of social exclusion. because what I would like to suggest is that this figure does, it is pulling together a regime of governance combining penal and military power on the one hand and actually humanitarian rationalities on the other hand. And again, I will use another quote from this time from a newspaper report, a Guardian report, on the visit of the French President Emmanuel Macron to Calais, where he said, where the report said that he also warned law enforcement officers their behavior must be exemplary, and reminded them that migrants were people who have traveled continents. These men and women are human beings. It is a delicate mission, and for it you must be exemplary and in absolute respect of professional ethics and absolute respect of the law. This means not waking people up in the middle of the night, not using tear gas during mealtimes. He said, any excessive behavior, he warned, would be punished. Now, I mean, obviously this is a deeply paradoxical statement. At the same time, even though you could say the sort of the sort of use of tear gas during mealtimes, the practice also of waking up families in the middle of the night, it also was sort of, we find similar kinds of concerns in our interviews. So here's one officer from the police immigration unit saying, I think the dynamics is about the victim perspective against the criminal, so these two. And one somehow does not manage to see both. You wish to be efficient and not come in vain, so turning up at 4 o'clock in the morning is perhaps efficient because you know that people will be there. But it is tough for those who are exposed to this. And when it is reported in the media, then you have that aspect as well. Is it unnecessary use of power and unnecessary use of force and such? So the case is that I think that these things are a bit difficult. And even though we feel perhaps that there is no substance in it, in criticism, that we are following the rules, what we are or that we are doing things properly, I think that at least we know that there is also that aspect. Because quite often the focus is the opposite. You get a very negative focus on foreigners and asylum seekers as suspicious. So I think the statement is revealing that activities of border control are sort of happening in a deeply problematic, contentious field and under intense media scrutiny, and also that you have this sort of the figures of both the question, are they victims or are they offenders, and how to behave humanely in deeply inhumane situations. And there has been work by, among other, Mary Bosworth and others pointing out that officers performing these kinds of, or also detention staff and so on, performing these kinds of tasks use various neutralization techniques and denial to be able to cope with these kinds of tasks. And that often sort of one tries to prioritize deportation of criminal offenders rather than deportation of children, for example. And to understand this, I've sort of been examining the work that has been done on the concept of moral economy, the concept which was sort of popularized by E.P. Thompson in his 1971 seminal essay. It was an analysis of food rioting in the 18th century and sort of looking at the legitimization of rioting in the eyes of the participants. Now, the concept of moral economy has been in recent decades, 2 decades, sort of resurrected, particularly by Didier Fassin and his co-workers in the sort of developing field of moral anthropology, also by Philippe Bourgeois, looking at practices of drug use and so on. The concept has been, through this sort of transdisciplinary migrations, freed of its class connotations. And Thompson was already in 1991 quite critical of this use of the concept, freed of the class connotations. Also, Fassin acknowledges that the concept runs the danger of sort of being meaningless or banal at the same time as it has been useful at looking or understanding particularly this construction of altruistic meanings which are given to certain acts which might otherwise be constructed according to other imperatives, such as, for example, waking children and families in the middle of the night, and so on. And I think it can be useful for understanding the paradoxic nature of the exercise of penal power in humanitarian borderlands. Now, if we are to bring it also closer to Thompson's work and the meaning that he gave to it, I think also there is another aspect that, at least in our material, that we find very interesting parallels. Because he situated it in the changing nature of work and production and the impact of market thinking and mass production on craftsmanship, or the transformation from craftsmanship to mass production, and that these kinds of transformation can create intense moral engagement. And in our material, we actually found out that officers were engaged, they were opposed, they were criticizing these kinds of practices, often not through directly expressed sympathies with migrants, but with the feeling that their work, particularly through the corrosive impact of new public management, was sort of reduced in terms of professionalism. And this kind of critique was actually quite also higher up in the system, not just on the ground level. So here's a statement. It was an official statement given by the leader of the Police Leaders Union in 2017, who said, "Frequent controls of individuals can be experienced as a burden. With more resources for detection and deportation follows extra pressure on police districts to deliver on the performance targets. Those who are to be deported do not, as a rule, wait in asylum centers. They have to be found. In some cases, the focus has been on residents, just to increase the numbers. Focusing on performance targets can lead to reduced trust in the police among people who feel they have been unfairly treated. It can be directly destructive for the reputation of the police." Now, similar sentiments, and also sort of framing the idea in terms of the critique, in terms of morality, were also expressed in the following interview with an experienced officer in Oslo, saying, "Well, it can be said that internally, within the police, there are different understandings of how to apply immigration law. It is just as well if this came out. Some look at this from an ethical perspective, that is us, while others are much more concerned with performance targets and such. And the ethical side thinks that performance targets are a wrong way of doing the work and admits that this is a sensitive field to work in, while it seems to me that the other side have not reflected on this well enough. I know that within the police immigration units there are disagreements as well." So we can see that there is actually, or at least there was a fair amount of debate within the police itself whether this sort of transformation towards focus on the immigration law and deportation was the right way to go, and that the officers felt that they were being under pressure. And in this kind of context, as I suggested, the notion of the Crimmigrant other performs a certain kind of work. And it was summarized by Guy Petterson during this parliamentary debate, who said, "I can say that the PU employees wish to do a good and professional job and work strongly against criminals, or those who have become criminals, with a final decision." So the final decision pertains to the legality of the deportation decisions, whereas the connection between professional job and criminals is actually quite an important aspect, because they wish to define their work as a way of sort of excluding criminal offenders. So the notion of the criminal other, then the work that it's mostly he does, is this power. He has the power to make distinctions and to constitute moral boundaries. These moral boundaries are sort of being constituted on several levels of the nation and through deportation practices, where, as Bridget Anderson points out, states, nation states, are not just sort of arbitrary collections of individuals, they are communities of value. But these distinctions are also happening within the level of what might be described as humanitarian consciousness, where Katja Franko has described this distinction between refugees and other migrants, where the category of refugees is sort of carved out of the category of either migrants, where most of the efforts, humanitarian efforts, are focused on them, where while the others sort of become obscured. Mary Bosworth has in her work described how, for example, foreign men are racialized and gendered, are defined as racialized and gendered others. So these ideas about Crimmigrant others sort of create hierarchies and distinctions between migrants, between good and bad, victims and offenders, members and non-members, and deserving and non-deserving. And precisely because these lines of distinction are framed in a language of goodness and empathy, as Didier Passan also has pointed out, it has difficulties actually in articulating a discourse of rights, justice, and inclusion for the unideal migrant. And I think this becomes particularly visible when it comes to the discussions about smuggling, which are particularly shaping the dynamics at the external borders of the EU, where the notion of the EU, of the evil smuggler, has sort of become a kind of suitable enemy, where the responsibility, particularly for the most tragic aspects of border control, such as migrant mortality in the Mediterranean, is very much squarely placed on this sort of evil and very organized criminal organizations. So Frontex, for example, in their reports, they write that the rising death toll mainly results from criminal activities aimed at making profit through the provision of smuggling services at any cost. And in the work that Helena and I did on Frontex, for example, they described sort of much more graphically in one of their reports. There's an officer describing an incident where he tells, "I was on mission last week." This is from a Frontex report. "It was Force 8 to Force 9, thunderstorm with hail. We got a call that there was a search and rescue case. We started looking just as the weather got very bad. Out of 12 people who were reported missing, 8 of them had been washed dead onto the shore. Among these, there was a 7-year-old girl. This girl had been promised heaven in the European Union, but she had been cheated of her life. She paid to be dead. The facilitators, the people traffickers, left her to die. It is very painful, very distressing." So we have very much this innocent victim of this girl, and then the figure of the evil trafficker. Julien Brachet, who's done research on trafficking networks in North Africa, points out that migrant deaths are not interpreted as an unfortunate product of border control, but as a compelling proof of the need to keep fighting the infamous smuggling networks that take advantage of the misery of others. So this notion of evil networks becomes a justification for stricter border control. Even though, as Gabriela Sanchez has pointed out, the reliance on smuggling emerges from the lack of accessible legal and safe mechanisms for mobility, and the sort of the organized crime nature of these networks is very much disputed in empirical scholarship. So to sort of approach conclusion, I would like to say that, in a sense, the idea of the Crimmigrant other has important aspects in terms of sort of creating and justifying strict control measures. Now, when it starts to sort of become problematic is when we have categories like when it comes to, for example, children mentioned before, or here we have one officer describing the following: "A policeman who has never read about the war. That is not good, right? Because Norwegian police made serious mistakes during the war years. It is a shameful side of our Norwegian police history. It should not happen that police, in a way, start hunting down groups and minorities which are keeping away from crime, just because they are from one group of people. Well, this is wrong. It's not like we wish to have 70-year-old grannies from Pakistan in police custody cells, right? What's the point, really? I think what is interesting about this statement is two things. In this case, it is not the sort of the innocent child, but it is equally innocent 70-year-old granny from Pakistan that sort of doesn't feel right. It is the sort of the criminal aspect of the identity just feels off. But what is interesting also is the reference to history and to the Second World War, and that was actually something that cropped up in several of the interviews and came as a bit of a surprise. But in a sense, the objections to the practices were partly sort of framed, as I said before, in terms of critique of new public management, of performance targets, of the decline in professionalism, or the sort of the references to the Second World War as in a way you could say the ultimate moral failure. The critique was not, interestingly, formed in the language of human rights. Human rights were not seen as sort of pertaining to the police officers. Perhaps it has something to do with Norwegian police officers and their self-identity. They feel that they master the human rights aspect. That this is something that Eastern European officers need to learn. But the history aspect was something that was sort of a heavy burden. And he's another officer. This is a quote from an article that Helena and I wrote some years ago about Frontex, who was sort of comparing the discomfort and framing it within the view of history. He said, "The most challenging part for me was that I talked about earlier. Well, it was so bad that my thoughts went to the dark side of our European history. I began to reflect over these are very personal thoughts, but I thought about those who were participating under Nazism, who were involved. Were they thinking the same as I am now? Did they try to find a way to justify it? Did they understand that what they were doing was wrong? Is it wrong? Should we be involved in this? Should we not be involved? I have a very large apparatus guarding my back, which in a way supports me that this is good. But then you see, at least I see, that nothing happens. What's the point? Many such things. This part has been a challenge, and we talked a fair amount about it down there. Not exactly with the same perspective, but about whether it was right for us to be involved. Are we contributing to something good, or are we just helping Greece to do something wrong? I hope that my children and grandchildren can look back on what their father and grandfather did as something that was right, that he did something good, that this will not be a shadow in European history that I have contributed to. I really hope so." So this sort of focus on history and the image of the Holocaust, I think is a sort of very interesting, or at the same time the absence of the discourse critical impact of human rights is, I think, a very interesting aspect of it. It is also, to conclude, I think if we look at sort of how these severe systems of social control have been understood previously, it has been very common to use them, to see them sort of this infliction of pain in terms of Bauman's famous analysis of social production of moral indifference, that such systems in a way eschew moral judgment. Now, from our material emerges a slightly different pictures, where this field is very much alive with all kinds of moral judgments, both doubt about morality, but also moral judgments of migrants, of people who think differently than themselves, but also about migrants as sort of worthy and unworthy, innocent and guilty. And I think this aspect of morality is something also that I would be also very happy to discuss with you in further discussion. I think I am sort of I'm ready to stop here now. And, yeah.